Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. Today, we're going deep into the world of anxiety disorders.
We are.
And we're using the book, Anxiety Disorders, An Introduction to Clinical Management and Research.
Great book.
It is. And think of us as your guides through the research on this topic. We're going to point out the most interesting landmarks and make sure you don't get lost.
Yeah, we'll be breaking down the latest scientific findings, but also make sure we make it relatable to you in your life.
Exactly, yeah. And right off the bat, the book makes it really clear how anxiety disorders, they aren't just a personal struggle.
Right.
They really have a ripple effect that impacts families, careers, even physical health.
They do.
Like a pebble dropped in a pond, the effects just spread far and wide.
And they really do. And in fact, the book uses this powerful quote to illustrate the point. Pathological anxiety severely affects the patient's existence, causing a state of dependence which most often starts in early adulthood and has long-standing consequences, disrupting both family life and professional career.
Wow. That is pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
It really paints a picture of how these disorders can take over someone's life.
Yeah, they do. And that's why it's so important to get a handle on them.
Okay, so let's break down what we're talking about here. What kinds of anxiety disorders are there?
Well, the book covers a whole range of them. Panic disorder, social phobia, specific phobias, generalized anxiety disorder. There's obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
Wow, that's a lot of them. It seems like there's a whole spectrum of anxiety,
Yeah,
from like the everyday worries we all have to like the more severe debilitating disorders.
right.
And, I think a lot of people might assume that these disorders are pretty rare. Like they know somebody that gets panic attacks or has a phobia or two, but they don't realize how widespread it is.
Right. A lot of people think that they're rare, but the research shows they're way more common than you might think.
Okay, spill the tea. How common are we talking? Give me some numbers.
So, for instance, did you know that more people suffer from social phobia than live in New York City? The lifetime prevalence is estimated at between 2 and 4% of the population, but some studies actually suggest it's 3 times higher than that.
Wow. That's a huge chunk of the population.
It is. And then there's OCD. It's often referred to as a hidden epidemic because it actually impacts 2 to 3% of the population, which is a lot higher than what people previously thought.
That is surprising. It really makes you think about how many people might be struggling silently with these disorders, maybe not even realizing that it's something that they could be getting treatment for.
Exactly, yeah. That's why raising awareness and talking about these issues is so important.
Absolutely. So, with all this anxiety swirling around, let's talk about what causes it.
Okay.
Is it nature, nurture, or a bit of both?
It's definitely a good question. And it's complex. The book actually dives into both sides of the argument, talking about how our genes can make us more likely to have anxiety, but also how our experiences, especially when we were kids, can shape our vulnerability to these disorders.
And speaking of early experiences, the book does really dive into how those can shape how vulnerable we are later in life. What did you find most interesting there?
Well, there's this fascinating connection between separation anxiety during childhood and developing panic disorder as an adult. It seems like early experiences of separation can make some individuals more susceptible to panic attacks.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So those early experiences can really have a lasting impact, even if they seem like distant memories. It really kind of makes you wonder if addressing those anxieties early on could potentially prevent more serious issues down the road.
That's actually what the book suggests. It really emphasizes how vital early intervention can be. It even says, investigation of childhood disorders clearly has many technical and ethical problems, but they afford a close look at the early phases of a pathogenic process before it is obscured by multiple secondary reactions and adaptations.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
It is, but basically understanding those root issues early on can help us see the full picture and intervene better, right?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, with all these types of anxiety disorders, is there one that's particularly well understood? One that kind of serves as a good example for how these conditions work?
Yes, the book uses panic disorder as a case study to really break down that interplay of psychological and physiological factors.
Okay.
It's a great example of how our minds and bodies can work together, sometimes in ways that don't really serve us very well.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting for me. I've heard a lot about panic attacks. But what exactly is going on in the body and mind when someone experiences one?
Imagine your brain is like a superhighway.
Okay.
Everything's going smoothly, and then suddenly there's this massive pileup.
Oh.
That's kind of what a panic attack feels like.
Yeah.
You have these really intense episodes of fear,
Right.
and then you have physical symptoms,
Right.
like a racing heart, shortness of breath, dizziness, things like that.
Yeah.
And then there's anticipatory anxiety,
Okay.
which is the fear of having another panic attack.
Right. Right.
And this fear, it can actually lead to avoidance behaviors, also known as agoraphobia.
Okay.
And that's where people start to avoid situations where they worry they might have another panic attack.
So it becomes this vicious cycle
It does.
where the fear fuels the avoidance and the avoidance just reinforces the fear?
Exactly. And there's another layer to this called interoceptive conditioning. It's basically where your body's own internal sensations, like a rapid heartbeat, become associated with the fear of having a panic attack. So even when those sensations happen naturally, like when you're exercising, it can trigger anxiety because of that learned association.
Wow. So it's like your body's turning against itself?
Yeah,
It's making normal sensations feel threatening?
it does.
That's wild.
And it's a key part of understanding how panic disorder develops.
Hmm.
The book also points out this fascinating clinical observation.
Right.
Almost always, panic attacks actually come before agoraphobia.
Oh, okay.
So those intense panic episodes happen first, and then the fear and avoidance follows.
So it's not that people with agoraphobia are afraid of open spaces or crowds necessarily.
Right.
It's that they've learned to connect those places with the possibility of having a panic attack.
Exactly.
So they're avoiding the trigger, not the place.
Exactly. That's a very important distinction.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, I'm a little anxious just thinking about it.
I can imagine.
How do researchers study these panic responses in a controlled way?
Well, they use this really interesting tool called the 35% CO2 challenge.
Okay.
It's designed to help them understand those panic responses
Mm.
and to test how well different treatments actually work.
Okay, 35% CO2 challenge. That sounds intense.
It can be.
Can you break it down for me?
It basically involves having people breathe in a mixture of carbon dioxide and oxygen, which actually triggers a physiological response that can induce panic-like symptoms in some individuals.
Mm.
But it's important to note that not everybody reacts to this challenge with panic.
That's what I was thinking. So who freaks out when they get a whiff of CO2?
That's where it gets really interesting. Studies actually show that people with panic disorder react very differently to this challenge than other groups, even people with other anxiety disorders.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it's not just a matter of being generally anxious. There's something specific about panic disorder that makes people more susceptible to this CO2-induced panic.
So you mentioned medication can be used to block those panic responses in the CO2 challenge.
Yeah.
What other options are there for people who struggle with anxiety disorders?
Well, there are a few different approaches, and what works best really can vary from person to person. Medication can be helpful for managing symptoms, but there's also growing evidence for the effectiveness of something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Ah, CBT. I've heard that mentioned for all kinds of mental health issues. How does it work its magic on anxiety?
Well, CBT is all about identifying and modifying those negative thought patterns and behaviors that contribute to anxiety.
Okay.
It helps you develop a new way of thinking about and reacting to the situations that make you anxious.
So it's not just about feeling better in the moment, it's about rewiring your brain for the long term.
Exactly. It gives you the tools to manage your anxiety, not just mask the symptoms.
Okay. Can you give me some examples? What kind of techniques does CBT actually involve?
So one technique is exposure therapy,
Okay.
where you gradually expose yourself to your fears, but in a safe and controlled environment.
Right.
The idea is to help you learn that those situations aren't actually dangerous.
Okay.
There's also cognitive restructuring, which focuses on challenging and replacing negative thoughts with more balanced and realistic ones.
Okay. So you're facing your fears and reframing your thinking. Makes sense. What else?
And breathing retraining can also be really helpful. It teaches you techniques to control your breathing,
Right.
which reduces the physical symptoms of anxiety,
Okay.
like a rapid heartbeat or shortness of breath.
So you're tackling those physical symptoms along with the mental and emotional ones.
Exactly. And what's really exciting about CBT is that it has promising and lasting results for a variety of different anxiety disorders. In some cases, it's even more effective than medication alone.
Wow. That's impressive. CBT really seems like a powerful tool for managing anxiety.
It is, and it actually speaks to the incredible plasticity of our brains. Even though anxiety may have those biological roots, we can actually rewire our brains
Hmm.
and change those ingrained patterns of thinking and reacting.
It's amazing to me how much our understanding of anxiety is constantly evolving. We're learning so much about the brain and the body and how they work together and sometimes against each other.
Yeah, it is.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, constantly uncovering new insights.
It's a fascinating field to study. And with every new discovery, we're getting closer to understanding those complexities of anxiety
Hmm.
and developing even more effective ways to actually manage it. And speaking of new discoveries, one thing that really jumped out at me in the book was the discussion of how panic attacks can actually be a symptom of other mental health conditions, not just panic disorder.
Oh, really? I thought panic attacks were pretty much synonymous with panic disorder. What other conditions can they show up with?
Well, they can occur with a whole range of conditions like depression, OCD, borderline personality disorder. They could even happen during brief psychotic episodes.
Wow, I had no idea. So, if someone has a panic attack, it doesn't automatically mean they have panic disorder. It could be a sign of something else entirely.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial to get a proper diagnosis.
Mm.
It's not just recognizing the panic attack itself, but it's understanding that bigger picture of what else might be going on.
So, how do clinicians figure out whether a panic attack is like a standalone issue or a symptom of something else?
Well, the diagnostic criteria take a lot of factors into account. They look at how often the panic attacks are happening, how severe they are, whether there's constant worry about having another attack,
Hmm.
and whether the person has started avoiding certain situations to try and prevent future attacks.
So, it's not just a one-time panic attack that raises a red flag. It's more about the pattern and how it's affecting someone's life.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to talk to a mental health professional if you're experiencing those panic attacks. They could really help you figure out what's going on and get you the right treatment.
That makes sense. So, we've talked about nature and nurture of anxiety disorders, and we took a deep dive into panic disorder. What other nuggets of wisdom did you unearth in this book?
Well, one thing that really struck me was the discussion of how anxiety disorders can manifest differently in men and women.
Right. I've heard that anxiety is more common in women. Is that what the book found?
Yes, there's definitely a gender difference in how often anxiety disorders occur. Studies consistently show that women are more likely to experience anxiety than men.
Hmm. Do they have any explanations for why that might be?
Well, it's another complex issue, but the book does point to a few potential factors. Everything from hormonal fluctuations to societal expectations, and even differences in how men and women tend to cope with stress.
That makes sense. So it's not just about women being more emotional, as some outdated stereotypes might suggest.
Not at all. It's this really complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. And the book dives into all those. It even talks about how women are more prone to experiencing panic attacks with agoraphobia, generalized anxiety, even depression alongside their anxiety.
So women are facing this double whammy, dealing with the anxiety itself, but also these additional challenges. That sounds incredibly difficult.
It really is. And it highlights the need for treatment approaches that are tailored to the unique needs and experiences of women.
I agree. Okay, so we've touched on gender differences. What else jumped out at you?
Well, the book also delves into the biological underpinnings of anxiety disorders, specifically looking at the role of different brain structures and neurotransmitters.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. Can you break down the neuroscience of anxiety for me?
Yeah, it's actually pretty fascinating. So, for example, research has identified this small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala,
Okay.
which plays a key role in both fear and anxiety.
The amygdala. I've heard of that. It's like the brain's alarm system, right?
Exactly. It's responsible for detecting threats in our environment and then triggering that fight or flight response.
Mhm.
And studies have shown that the amygdala is often overactive in people with anxiety disorders. So it's like their alarm system is constantly going off, even when there's no real danger present.
So it's not just that people with anxiety are being irrational or overdramatic. There's an actual biological basis for their heightened fear response.
Precisely. And the book also talks about the role of other brain regions, like the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like planning and decision-making. And all these areas are thought to be involved in that complex interplay of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we see in anxiety disorders.
So it's like a whole network of brain areas working together to create that feeling of anxiety.
Yeah, in a way. And then you have neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers that allow brain cells to communicate with each other.
Right, those play a role in all sorts of mental processes. What do they have to do with anxiety?
Well, one of the key neurotransmitters involved in anxiety is called serotonin. It's known to regulate mood, sleep, and appetite, among other things.
Serotonin, that's the one that antidepressants target, right?
You got it. And it turns out that serotonin also plays a big role in anxiety. Research shows that people with anxiety disorders often have imbalances in their serotonin levels.
Interesting. So serotonin isn't just about depression, it's a multitasker when it comes to mental health. What about other neurotransmitters?
Another important one is gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA for short.
GABA, that one sounds familiar too. What does it do?
Well, think of GABA as your brain's braking system. It helps to calm things down and prevent overexcitation.
So if serotonin is the accelerator, GABA is the brake pedal.
That's a great analogy. And research suggests that people with anxiety disorders may not have enough GABA, which means that their brains might not be able to regulate that overexcitation as effectively, leading to those feelings of anxiety and panic.
Interesting. So it's not just about having too much of a fear signal, it's also about not having enough of a calm down signal.
Exactly. And of course, there are other neurotransmitters involved as well, like norepinephrine, which is part of that fight or flight response, and dopamine, which plays a role in reward and motivation.
Right.
But what's really important to remember is that this is all happening at a microscopic level in your brain.
Okay, so it's this incredibly complex symphony of brain chemicals that can get out of tune and lead to anxiety. I imagine this is where medications come in, trying to rebalance those neurotransmitter levels.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, yes. But we talked about CBT earlier, and that doesn't involve medication. So if anxiety is rooted in these biological processes, how can a therapy that focuses on thoughts and behaviors make a real difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems like you'd need to address the root biological cause to truly overcome anxiety.
Well, that's a common misconception. While the biological underpinnings of anxiety are real, there's a growing understanding of the brain's incredible plasticity.
Plasticity, what does that mean?
Essentially, it means that the brain is not fixed. It's constantly changing and adapting in response to our experiences. Even though anxiety might be rooted in our biology, our experiences can actually shape and change those biological processes.
Wow, so we're not stuck with our anxiety. We have the power to change our brains and overcome those anxious tendencies.
That's right. And that's where CBT comes in. By changing our thoughts and behaviors, we can actually rewire those neural pathways and retrain our brains to react differently to anxiety-predicting situations.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring the many facets of anxiety disorders. From their prevalence and impact to their causes and treatment options, what about treatment options besides medication and CBT? What else did the book discuss?
Well, the book emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to treating anxiety. What works for one person might not work for another. So it's all about finding that individualized treatment plan that takes your specific symptoms, history, and preferences into account.
So it's not as simple as just taking a pill or doing a few therapy sessions.
Not necessarily. It often requires a more holistic approach. The book talks about things like relaxation techniques, such as deep breathing exercises, mindfulness meditation, and even yoga. And these practices can help calm the nervous system and reduce those physical symptoms of anxiety.
That makes sense. I can see how those activities would be helpful for managing stress and anxiety. What else did they mention?
They also discuss the importance of lifestyle factors. Things like getting enough sleep, eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, and limiting things like caffeine and alcohol.
So it's not just about therapy and medication, it's about taking care of your overall well-being.
Exactly. The book really emphasizes that addressing anxiety often requires that multifaceted approach, combining those lifestyle changes with professional help.
Makes sense, right? Our mental health is so interconnected with our physical health, our habits, our environment, our relationship. It's all part of the same puzzle.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance and creating a lifestyle that really supports your mental and emotional well-being.
So we've talked about the various treatments for anxiety disorders. What about prevention? Is there anything people can do to reduce their risk of developing these conditions in the first place?
Well, while the book didn't dive deep into specific prevention strategies, it did highlight the importance of early intervention.
So catching those early warning signs and seeking help before those anxieties become more serious problems.
Exactly. And it also discussed the role of resilience.
Resilience. I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
Well, resilience is basically the ability to bounce back from adversity, to cope with stress and challenges without being completely overwhelmed by them. And while some people may have a genetic predisposition to resilience, it's also something that can be cultivated over time.
So it's like building mental muscles to weather those inevitable storms of life.
That's a great way to put it. And the book suggests that building resilience can involve things like developing strong social connections, practicing mindfulness, challenging those negative thought patterns, and setting realistic expectations for yourself.
That sounds like good advice for anyone, whether they're struggling with anxiety or not.
I agree. These are practices that can benefit everyone's mental and emotional well-being.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, exploring the many facets of anxiety disorders, from their prevalence and impact to their causes and treatment options. What are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, it's important to remember that anxiety disorders are incredibly common. They affect a huge portion of the population, and there's absolutely no shame in seeking help.
It's not a weakness. It takes a lot of strength to acknowledge you're struggling and reach out for support.
Exactly. And the good news is that there are effective treatments available. Whether it's medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, or a combination of approaches, there's hope for recovery.
There's no need to suffer in silence.
Another key takeaway is that anxiety disorders are complex. They arise from an intricate interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. And understanding that complexity is essential for developing effective treatment plans.
It's not just about thinking happy thoughts or popping a pill. It's about addressing those underlying factors and developing healthy coping mechanisms.
Precisely. It's about taking a holistic approach to your mental well-being.
And finally, I think it's important to remember that the brain is incredibly adaptable. It's not fixed. Through therapy, lifestyle changes, and even the power of our own thoughts, we can actually rewire those neural pathways and retrain our brains to respond differently to anxiety-provoking situations.
I completely agree. That's one of the most hopeful and empowering messages I took away from the book.
Me too. So even though anxiety can feel overwhelming and debilitating at times, there's hope for recovery.
Absolutely. There is.
This has been like a truly eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about how anxiety disorders work, all the intricate details.
Yeah. It's been great exploring this with you. And speaking of exploring, there's one more fascinating concept from the book I wanted to touch on.
Okay.
It's called learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness. That sounds a bit ominous. What is that all about?
Well, it's this idea that came out of research on animals, actually. But it really sheds light on how anxiety works in us humans, too.
Okay.
Basically, it refers to this state of passivity and resignation that can develop when someone repeatedly experiences things that are unpleasant and that they can't control.
So it's like if you keep getting stung by bees no matter where you go, you eventually just give up and stop trying to avoid them.
Yeah, exactly. You learn that your actions really don't change the outcome, so you just stop trying altogether. And this feeling of helplessness, it can actually spread to other areas of your life, even situations where you might actually have some control.
That makes sense. So you start to believe that you're powerless to change your circumstances, even when that might not be true.
Right. And this can contribute to anxiety in a couple of ways. First, it can lead to those avoidance behaviors because you think, well, what's the point of trying if I can't change anything?
Right.
And second, it can make you more vulnerable to stress and anxiety in general because you feel less equipped to cope with those challenges.
So it's like a vicious cycle. You're feeling helpless, avoiding challenges, and then feeling even more helpless because you're not facing those challenges.
Exactly. And that's where CBT can be so helpful. One of the goals is to really help people regain a sense of control over their anxiety.
Okay.
By learning to identify and challenge those negative thought patterns, developing effective coping mechanisms, they can start to believe that they actually do have the power to influence their experiences and manage their anxiety.
It's all about breaking free from that learned helplessness and empowering yourself to take back control.
That's a great way to put it. It's about realizing that you're not just a passive passenger in your own life. You have the ability to steer the ship, even when things get tough.
I love that analogy. This whole conversation has really highlighted how complex anxiety disorders are. There's so much more going on beneath the surface than we might realize.
It's true. Anxiety is a powerful force, but it's not invincible. And as we continue to learn more about the brain and genetics and that intricate play between nature and nurture, we're gaining a much deeper understanding of how to manage and even overcome anxiety.
It's exciting to think about how much our understanding is constantly evolving, what new insights might emerge in the future, and how might they shape how we approach treatment and prevention.
Well, think about how far we've come in understanding the brain. As we delve deeper into fields like epigenetics, which explores how our environment can actually influence gene expression, we might discover completely new ways to prevent anxiety disorders from ever developing.
Wow. That would be incredible. Imagine being able to stop those anxious tendencies from taking root in the first place.
It really would be a revolution in mental health care.
Yeah.
And, advancements in technology like neuroimaging and personalized medicine could lead to even more tailored and effective treatment approaches.
It sounds like there's a lot to be hopeful for. Even though anxiety is so widespread and often so challenging, it feels like we're on the cusp of some really big breakthroughs in understanding and treating it.
I agree. There's so much potential for progress. And in the meantime, remember that you're not alone. Anxiety is incredibly common, and there is help available. Don't be afraid to reach out.
That's such an important message. Whether you're dealing with an anxiety disorder or just feeling really overwhelmed by life's challenges, there are resources out there to help you navigate those rough waters and find your way back to calmer seas.
Exactly. And remember, our understanding of anxiety is constantly evolving. New research is coming out all the time. So there's always hope for even more effective treatments and prevention strategies in the future.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay hopeful. Until next time, keep diving deep.